He won the lottery thinking he'd get rich, but they gave him a beautiful Apache slave instead. The ticket was a folded scrap of brown paper, number 41 written in pencil, and I paid $1 for it off a man named Prout who said the town of Callow Springs was raffling off a land parcel. 40 acres east of the creek, good grass, a small house already standing. I needed that land. I'd been sleeping in my bedroll behind the livery for 6 weeks. That was the spring of 1873, and I was 44 years old and had not much to show for it. The drawing was held in front of the assay office on a Saturday. Half the town crowded around. Prout climbed up on a wagon bed and reached into a feed sack and pulled out a slip and read the number out loud, and I felt something lift in my chest. The number was mine. People near me turned to look. A couple of them clapped, slow and polite. Then Prout said there'd been a change. He said it like it was nothing. Said the land parcel had fallen through, deed dispute, surveyor error, something he waved away with one hand, but the prize was still a prize, he said. Said the winner would receive full title to property of equal or greater value. He smiled when he said it. They brought her out from behind the wagon. She was Apache, I could see that plain. Her wrists were bound with a length of braided leather. She was wearing a calico dress that didn't belong to her, too big in the shoulders, and she was standing straight in it like it didn't matter. Her hair was dark and long, and she was looking at nothing in particular, not me, not Prout, not the crowd. She was somewhere else entirely behind her eyes. The crowd made a noise, not an ugly noise, just interested, the way men sound at an auction. Prout said her name was whatever the previous owner had called her, and that she was healthy and could cook and was quick to learn, and that she'd been acquired legally out of a raiding party dispute down in the Guadalupe country. He said all of this fast, looking at me, like he was expecting me to step forward and take the leather lead he was holding out. I looked at the woman. She didn't look back. I looked at Prout. I said loud enough that the men around me could hear, "Cut her loose." Prout blinked, said he didn't follow. I said it again, "Cut her loose right now or I'm going to the marshal." There wasn't any real marshal in Callow Springs, and Prout likely knew that, but the crowd had shifted a little, not all of them comfortable now, a few of them watching me different. Prout tried once more, said I'd won her fair, said she was worth more than the land, said I'd be a fool to walk away. I said I wasn't walking away from anything. I said I was taking what was mine. I walked up and I took the lead from his hand, and I cut the braided leather at her wrists with my belt knife, and I dropped it in the dirt. She looked at me then, first time. Just for a second. I told Prout I wanted the 40 acres or I wanted my $1 back, and a signed note saying the raffle was a fraud. He decided he'd rather give me the $1. Then I turned to the woman and said she was free to go wherever she needed to go. I pointed north and south and east and west, meaning all of it, meaning none of it was mine to keep her from. She didn't move. I walked back to the livery, and she followed me at about 20 feet, which I didn't understand and didn't ask about. Her name, I learned over the next few days, was something I could not say right in Apache. She eventually let me call her Na, which was close enough to part of it that she didn't correct me. She'd been taken 14 months before, sold twice, and had walked through country I knew was brutal without boots for part of it. She was 26 or 28. She wasn't certain herself, and she had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a thing she didn't explain and I didn't press. I was not sure what to do with the situation. I had a bedroll, a horse named Comet who was getting on in years, a rifle, a skinning knife, $41 and no fixed purpose. I'd been moving since my wife Dolores died in '69 of the fever that took half the county that year. I drifted from Kansas down through the territory, picking up work where I could, fence mending, freight hauling, a brief and embarrassing attempt at running cattle on shares that cost me more than it made me. I was not a man who'd given up exactly. I just hadn't found a reason to stop moving. We made a camp a mile outside of town because I wasn't going back into Callow Springs if I could avoid it. Now watch me set the fire, and then, the second night, she moved me aside and set it herself, which she did differently and better, the smoke lying low and the heat radiating out wide instead of straight up. I watched her and didn't say anything, and she didn't look up to see if I was watching. She ate what I had, which was not much. She slept across the fire from me. On the third morning she was gone when I woke up, and I felt something drop in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel. And I lay there in my bedroll looking at the sky and trying to figure out what it meant. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself she was a free woman, and that was what I'd wanted. She came back at noon with a sage grouse she'd caught, didn't say how, and set about cleaning it with my skinning knife like she'd used it 100 times. We ate well that evening. She handed the knife back handle first without looking at me, and I took it, and that was the whole of the conversation. We stayed near Callow Springs because I had a problem. Prute's man, a thick-necked rider named Cass who wore a hat too small for his head, had been following us. Not subtle about it. He'd been at the edge of the tree line the second morning, and on a low ridge above us the third. On the fourth day, I tied Comet and walked a wide circle around the camp, and came up behind him, where he was sitting his horse on the ridge. I said, "You tell Prute the woman is free. You tell him I'll put this in front of every federal man I can find if he keeps this up." Cass said Prute had a bill of sale and a legal document, and that what I'd done at the raffle was theft, which was a bold piece of law to invent. I said he could tell that story to whoever he liked and I'd tell mine, and we'd see which one the judge believed. Cass looked at my rifle and looked at me, and then he turned his horse around and rode. When I got back to camp, Now was standing, watching the ridge. She'd seen it. She looked at me for a long moment, the same look she'd given me in front of the assay office, but longer this time, and something in it that I couldn't read except that it wasn't nothing. She said a word in Apache I didn't know. I said I didn't understand. She nodded like that was fine and went back to the fire. I decided to go north. Not for any particular reason except north was away from Callow Springs and away from Prute, and I figured I'd find work somewhere between where we were and the Montana Territory. I told Na this, showed her on a rough sketch I drew in the dirt, here to here, and said she was welcome to travel with me as long as it suited her, or to go any other direction she chose. She thought about it for what felt like a full minute. Then she erased my sketch with her foot and drew her own, a route I didn't recognize at first, more east than I'd planned, hitting water sources I hadn't known about. She tapped the sketch twice, meaning, "This is the better way." I looked at it. I said, "All right." She covered the fire. We moved. The country between the Guadalupe foothills and the Canadian Breaks is beautiful in a way that takes getting used to. It's too big at first. The sky sits too heavy. Men who come from the east often have a physical reaction to it, a kind of shrinking, like they feel themselves getting smaller the further in they go. I'd had that years ago and long since lost it. And never had it at all. She moved through that country the way water moves, finding the easy way without appearing to look for it, reading the ground beneath her feet, knowing things about where we were that I was still figuring out. She taught me some of it without intending to, or maybe intending to, I couldn't always tell. I'd watch her read the tracks of something and then look up at the sky and then look at me and hold up 2 fingers, meaning 2 hours, meaning we needed to move before the weather came. The weather always came. I started listening to her the way I'd listened to a man who'd been on that trail longer than me. And after a week I stopped thinking of it as trusting a woman and started thinking of it as trusting someone who knew more than I did, which was easier and also just true. She was quiet, but she wasn't empty. There was a quality to her attention, a sharpness, that I found myself noticing more than I expected to. She didn't miss much. She noticed the way men carried themselves when we hit the occasional settlement. She noticed what I did before I did it, and twice she touched my arm and turned me in a different direction before I'd spotted the trouble myself. One of those times was 3 men outside a trading post who had the look of men with nothing to lose, and she'd steered me onto a different path without a word, and the men had watched us go with the dead eyes of men who were calculating something, and I understood that she'd read them correctly, and I was grateful. I told her thank you. She looked at me sideways, walking, and made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing. We reached a small settlement called Riddle Creek at the end of the 3rd week. It was a ranching town, a dozen buildings, a water trough, a general store with a broken sign. A man named Hollis Crane ran the cattle operation there and needed a hand for branding and fence work. The pay was fair and I was low on supplies. Crane was a widower, maybe 50, who ran his place correctly and treated his hands without contempt, which was not nothing. He looked at Now when I introduced her. I said she was traveling with me. I said nothing else. And he nodded once, the way a man nods when he's decided something isn't his business and means it. We stayed 2 weeks. Na helped in the cook camp, not because anyone asked her to, but because she seemed to find idleness uncomfortable. The camp cook was a half-Comanche man named Rel who spoke to her in a trade pidgin I couldn't follow, and she spoke back. And I'd watch them from a distance and feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was something like peace, except it had an edge to it. The edge was this: I was starting to want her to stay. Not in the way a man wants a thing he can own. I knew that much about myself. It was simpler than that and also harder. I liked the way she moved around a camp. I liked waking up and seeing the fire already built. I liked the silence we'd worked out together, the particular silence of 2 people who don't need to fill everything up with words. Dolores had been like that too, quiet and competent and sure of herself, and I'd loved that in her. And I'd told myself for 4 years that I was done with loving anyone, and I'd half believed it. I hadn't thought about what Na wanted. I'd been so busy not owning her that it hadn't occurred to me to wonder if she was choosing me, or just choosing safety, or just choosing the most practical direction to walk. It was Rel who told me. We were mending a fence line on the east pasture, 4 days into the 2nd week, and Rel said without looking up from the wire, "She's not staying because she has nowhere to go." I said, "What?" He said it again. I said, "How do you know that?" He said she'd told him. He said she had family north of the breaks, 2 brothers and a sister, that she knew where they were and could get to them in 5 days on her own. He said she'd considered going. He said he was telling me this because he thought I should know. I went back to the fence. I worked for a while. The wire bit into my gloves and I didn't feel it. Finally I said, "Why is she still here then?" Rel said, "You'd have to ask her that." I didn't ask her that night. I didn't ask her the next day. I worked out what I wanted to say, and then I worked out that I was afraid to say it, and that fear sat in me like a stone. I had not been afraid of much in my life, not of hard work, not of weather, not of men who wanted to take things from me, but I was afraid of this. The possibility that she'd been trading safety for freedom the whole time without my knowing. The morning before we were set to leave Riddle Creek, I went and found her where she was sitting near the water trough, doing something with a length of cord, a kind of knotwork I didn't recognize. I crouched down next to her. I said, "Rel told me about your brothers." She kept working the cord. I said, "I want you to know you can go. I'll give you the horse. Comet's getting slow, but he'll get you there. I'll manage." She stopped working the cord. She looked at me, full on, the way she almost never did. I said, "I mean it. I should have said this sooner. You've been free this whole time and I know that, but I don't know what I've been thinking. I haven't been thinking clear." A long pause. She set the knotwork down in her lap and she reached out and put her hand on my forearm. Just her hand flat on my arm, no grip, just weight. She held it there. She said, "I know the way north." I said, "I know you do." She said, I know the way you're going too. I didn't say anything. My throat was doing something I hadn't given it permission to do. She said, I'm going your way. She said it like it was simple, like it was just a fact she was reporting, the same tone she used when she told me 2 hours before the weather, matter of fact and certain. Not asking, not offering, just saying what was true. I put my hand over hers on my arm. I sat there in the dirt next to the water trough, and I put my hand over hers, and neither of us said anything for a while. The light was early morning, low and gold, coming in sideways under the clouds, and somewhere on the other side of the stock fence, a calf was calling out for something. I had not felt chosen in a long time. I want to say that right because it's the right word for what I felt. Not lucky, not relieved, chosen, by a woman who had every reason to go a different way and chose this one instead. We left Riddle Creek on a Tuesday. Crane gave me a fair wage and extra supplies and shook my hand and said to come back if we needed work, which was about the highest praise you'd get in that country. Rel said something to Na in the trade pigeon, and she laughed, actual laughter, low and quick, and I looked at her face when she laughed because I hadn't heard it before. I thought, I am going to hear that again. We rode north out of Riddle Creek, Na on Comet. Me on a roan Crane had sold me cheap, and the land opened up the way land does up there in late spring, the grass already coming green where the creek ran close to the trail, the sky pale and enormous. She was riding ahead of me by half a length, reading the trail the way she always did, and I watched her back, the set of her shoulders, the way she moved with the horse, and I thought about 44 years and all the country I'd covered and all the places I'd tried to stop and couldn't. I thought about Prute's wagon and the $1 I'd paid and the ticket with 41 written in pencil. I thought about what I'd expected from that day and what I'd gotten instead. I would not have traded it for the 40 acres. I want to say that straight. I would not have traded any part of it. We rode until midday. When she finally pulled Comet up at a creek crossing and stepped down to let him drink, I pulled up beside her and stepped down too. She was looking at the water. I stood next to her. She said without turning, there is a valley 3 days north. My brothers will have it good for cattle. I said, is that where we're going? She said, that's where we're going. I said, all right. She turned her head and looked at me with those dark, steady eyes, and the light was coming off the water, and there was a half smile there, the kind you wear when you already know how something ends. I didn't need to say anything. Neither did she. We let the horses drink, and then we rode. I've thought a lot about that lottery. Prute standing on the wagon bed with his hand in the feed sack, all of us standing in the dust waiting to hear what we'd won. I won the right thing. I just won it wrong, and I had to cut loose a piece of braided leather to get to it. There's a valley 3 days north of Riddle Creek where the grass comes in thick in the spring, and the creek runs clean and cold all summer. My brothers-in-law, if you want to call them that, are solid men who work hard and do not give their trust easily, and gave me enough of it over time that I consider myself honored. There is a house there now. Not the house that was promised on that brown paper ticket, but a house I built with my own hands in the 2nd year, with Na beside me laying the stone foundation level by level, neither of us needing to talk much about it. She still reads the weather better than I do. She still wakes before me and has the fire going before I'm on my feet. She still handles a knife better than most men I've known. And some mornings, when the light comes in flat and cold, and she's standing at the door looking out at the valley with her arms crossed and that still look on her face, I think about Prute's hand going into that feed sack, and I think about what I was looking for when I paid my $1, and I think, he gave me exactly what I needed without knowing it. He thought he was cheating me. He thought he was handing me a consolation prize. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. But that one most of all.